was sick.
Right, that's my one good turn from the year. That's me done. I'll see you next year, folks.
Yeah.
Ooh, 38. Mountain biking is excellent.
The Unno Burn is a brand new enduro bike from Cesar Rojo's boutique brand, easily identified by their unique aesthetic. The bike, which sports mixed wheels and 160 millimeters of rear-wheel travel, also has looks that are distinctive. With the Spanish brand delivering mountain biking's very own version of the Habsburg jaw, they've given the Burn a seat tube that towers over the rest of the bike. This bike is obviously more than its seat tube, but it is a smoking gun to illustrate the brand's determination to make something that was very different and thoroughly Unno.
This bike looks drastically different to any of the others. That high stack, flat one-piece bar, really slender top tube, and of course that very, very, very long seat tube. Why have they done this?
One of the reasons is that Unno wanted to incorporate their dual co-rotating link suspension design. So kind of the bike is built around that. It's designed to run between 35 to 40% sag, which is quite a lot.
That is quite a lot. So these ultra progressive bikes, in terms of their suspension feel, can be really good because they're easy to get into their travel and can be really smooth off the top. What are some of the drawbacks of an ultra progressive suspension system?
So with a design like this that's very progressive, you do get that initial nice sensitivity. It can really help with the small bumps, but then deeper on, you can sometimes encounter what we call a wall of support, and that can make it difficult to use full travel.
The bike, which is tied for the lightest on test at 33.4 pounds, is happy to not only offer a distinctive look, but also a suspension system with characteristics that will set it apart from the rest. With a fairly high sag number and extremely high suspension progression, the Kinematic is also certainly an outlier in this year's test. The high front end, moderate reach, and long rear center seem to capitalize and build upon all the lessons learned in recent years. All that said, what's it like to climb?
When it comes to climbing, I would say this bike, that progressive suspension does come back to reward it. It's got great grip, it's relatively smooth off the top, and tracking is also really good.
One potential drawback is the positioning might not be to everyone's taste. It has that really high stack height, which I personally like, puts you in a nice upright position, but for riders that prefer to climb with their weight a little bit more over the front wheel, it can make it challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say though, for the more conservative riders who perhaps consider how well a bike climbs is all about efficiency, this bike really does deliver that when you get the power on the pedals.
Yep, and that's a good thing because it's really difficult to reach the climb switch. So luckily you don't have to reach it. It is great and very efficient, so they've got that part sorted out.
With the short stem, somewhat slack seat tube, deep sitting shock, and high stack, the Burn can feel a bit too light on the front end at times through more technical sections. Regardless, this bike does climb well, if only it weren't held back by the comically short 150mm dropper. Providing you can stop and slam the saddle out of the way, which is not a given considering the 460mm seat tube length, which is a whole 55mm longer than something reasonable like the Ibis, how does this bike handle the descents?
When it comes to descending, really the Unno's strength is the ease that it goes into its travel, especially when you're kind of on the smaller chattery bumps. That feels really good, but it's not without its drawbacks.
No, absolutely. I mean, even on those small chattery slow speed bumps, you are getting quite a lot of noise out of this bike. Even things like the water bottle rattles on the underside of the top tube, and it can be really, really distracting.
Yeah. Noise aside, I prefer the bike when you're on slower speed steeps. That's where I felt the geometry worked the best and the suspension design. That high stack really puts you in a good position. But again, there's trade-offs to this very progressive layout.
On steep stuff, the tracking and the way it used its first portion of travel was really, really exceptional. One thing though that I couldn't ever really get my head around is the compromises they made for this system to have it packaged in that way. That seat tube is so long, and it's also got quite a low insertion depth, which means on our size large, we had a 150mm dropper that was also too high, but then when it was up at full extension, not quite high enough.
Yeah, and it just kind of seems silly that you'd have to do like you used to do, get off the bike, lower the seat in order to go down. Yeah,
it's got that wedge, it hasn't even got a clamp. So the whole thing is kind of a bit of a mess.
I kind of alluded to it before, but the greatest strength I'd say of the suspension layout is that small bump sensitivity.
Yeah, that small bump sensitivity, which is excellent when the speed of the trail is slower, does kind of come back to bite you when it's going faster pace, because you blast through, or at least I felt, blast through that first half of the travel and then hitting that wall of support, which could be downright uncomfortable. And I never really felt that it was able to really maximize all of that travel it had on offer.
Yeah, suspension setup is definitely tricky on this bike, and all of us tried different combinations and never maybe quite found the perfect one, so that's tricky. As far as the frame stiffness goes, we were in agreement that it was a nice blend of being stiff without being too stiff. It is pretty comfortable, kind of that racy feel, but it's also not rattling your fillings out.
The Burn, much like its suspension then, is a tale of two halves, depending on the speed of the trail that you're riding. But there is more than meets or even draws the eye when it comes to this frame.
When it comes to the frame itself, it has got some really nice features though. I think that frame storage is actually really well executed. It's simple, but really effective.
Yeah, they did a good job there. The whole thing with the frame though is it's kind of, there's a lot of compromises they did to incorporate that suspension design. At least that's the way that it feels. And not everything, I know you just end up with from the beginning it's compromised.
Absolutely. It's funny because we really liked the angles of this bike, if not necessarily the dimensions. So the reach was good, the rear length was good, and the head angle was fantastic. The problem is, when it comes to geometry, you can't really overlook that seat tube. It just is completely out of place on an enduro bike going into 2024.
Yeah, exactly. And going on with that, with geometry, there's only 3 sizes, so it's going to kind of initially limit the number of people that could potentially fit the bike. They also have the same chainstay length for all 3 sizes, which isn't the end of the world, but we're definitely starting to see more companies go to that different chainstay size for different lengths.
It's definitely a divisive prospect then, and apart from somebody who wants a bike with enough gold to make a pirate blush, who is the Unno Burn for?
The ideal candidate for this bike is really someone, I guess, who wants to stand out. I mean, it's rare that you're going to see one of these bikes on the trail. It's definitely different. You're flying your seat post flag high if you're on this bike.
Yeah, it's either very flash or a bit gauche. It depends.
Yeah.
Depends which way you look at it. Yeah, when it comes to people who shouldn't consider this bike or wouldn't be suited to them, it would be anybody that wants to have a continuous ride where they can use a dropper as intended, because you will be reaching for your 4mm to do that little wedge bolt to change the saddle height between descents and climbs. Secondly, I'd say if you like to ride flat out rough trails, there are better platforms out there.
Yeah, exactly. I will say it's good on the slower speed, steep tech, but again, speeds increase, you kind of run into some issues with that suspension.
That divisive prospect begins to sound more and more like a poor compromise, but what's this bike best at?
So for strengths and weaknesses, I think it thrives on slow tech, it offers excellent grip, and fundamentally there are some really great geometry figures in there.
As for weaknesses, it's that seat tube height again. It's just too long, and even if you chopped that seat tube height in half, you still wouldn't be able to run a longer travel dropper post because it would hit the bottom of the seat tube. So it is really, we keep saying the word, but it's compromised from the start. And then also the suspension design, that high rate of progression is not going to be for everyone. When you hit that towards the end of the stroke, it can make it feel harsh at higher speeds. So again, it's not going to be to everyone's taste.
The Unno represents something luxurious, different, all with that supercar 80s Lamborghini look. While we applaud the ambition in making something so different and really enjoyed some of the aspects of the geometry, you just can't look past that seat tube. Unno thrives off the idea that at the helm is a progressive thinker that has a hand in some of the most important bikes in recent years. But the Burn feels like maybe one radical choice too far, and ironically it confines this super futuristic bike to a bygone era. At over 8,000 euros, it's not unreasonable for the consumer to hope for a bike that doesn't have such an Achilles heel.